that you want us to fulfill your role for us, which is to glorify you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Now, in the broader context of the book of 1 Corinthians, the main thing from which we must not be distracted is the supremacy of God's glory in everything that we do, even in things as simple as eating and drinking. So here's what I hope to do this morning as we look at a very specific set of teaching in a much broader context. I want to define a few important terms that come up in this passage, which will contribute to our understanding of it. And then after we've defined those terms, I want to deal with the outward issues of the passage and then finally conclude by tying it all back in to the main thing. First of all, we have these terms, and I'm going to look at three terms, which are traditions, head, and then not a term, but a phrase, because of the angels, just because it just feels so out of the blue. Why does he say angels there? So we'll try to answer that question. First of all, in verse 2, we have this reference to tradition. Paul says, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything, and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them to you." Now, it's kind of hard to say, but I'm feeling a little sarcasm here. After all, we're in chapter 11 of 10 chapters of solid rebuke because they did not adhere to his teaching, but instead rather went off the beaten path in a number of different areas. There might not be sarcasm here, but I think there is. It feels like Paul has got his tongue in his cheek. Now, the main concern here is whether or not Paul is delivering this passage and this teaching about head coverings and about authority structures as a matter of tradition for that church. And so we need to understand what Paul means by tradition and to decide whether or not our general definition of tradition is the same as what Paul is expressing here, or if we need to tweak our understanding of that word when Paul uses it. Because I think that there's a difference here. So when we think of tradition, we maybe think of good things, probably. I remember one family tradition at Christmas and at Thanksgiving. My dad's mom, Bernice Delich, would have two things that she would do. And one of the things that she would do, actually at almost all family gatherings, is she would just walk into the room randomly and ask, "Is everybody happy?" And, some people would answer her, yes. Some people would answer her, no. And it became a long-standing family joke, and she ended up enduring a lot of raillery because of the question that she would come in and ask. I think eventually she stopped because we were so mean to her. We weren't mean, but that was a tradition, a very, very neutral tradition. But it was her desire to remind everyone. I don't think the question was for her information. It was her desire to remind everyone that we were at a family gathering where we should be interacting with one another on a standing of joy and happiness. And it was her attempt to remind us that that was the atmosphere which ought to be present in our family gatherings. I think it was a good thing. Now, when I was these kids' age, I didn't get it, and so I made fun of her. Now I regret that a little. But if you knew my grandma and my grandpa, well, if you knew my family, you guys know my family. We tend to pick on each other, so it comes with the territory. Now, the other thing, which I suspect that some of your families do as well, is when we would all sit down and be ready to eat, Grandma, again, it's all Grandma's fault, would get up and say, "Before we eat," and everyone's like, "Oh." I want everyone to go around the table and say something that they're thankful for. How many of you have done that in family stuff? Okay, you guys put your hands down. Not anywhere near as enough of you. This is just, it's excellent sauce for a hungry stomach to have to wait an extra 10 minutes for that food. You don't have to do it right before the meal either. You can do it at other times. Once again, we kids would be like, "Oh, now I got to come up with something." And then, of course, 3 people in front of you, because there was invariably 30, 40 people there. I'd have mine all ready to go, and then 3 people in front of me would say the one I was going to say. And so then I wouldn't have anything to say anymore that didn't sound like I was just copying them, and so I'd have to be thinking about it. What am I going to say? Oh, it was a terrible time. I tell you what, sometimes it didn't make me feel more thankful, but it was a tradition, right? It was a thing that we as a family did on a regular basis at certain times of the year to create us an intentional an intentional situation or atmosphere. I think it was a good thing. I didn't understand it completely at the time, but it was a good thing. Now, that is, I think, what we generally define or give example to tradition as. That's our idea of tradition. I don't think that's what Paul means. A lot of people look at this passage and they say, see, this is just tradition, and they do an end run around the whole passage and say, this was just tradition in the Church of Corinth, it doesn't apply to us. If Paul does indeed mean tradition the way that I just described tradition, then we can skip this passage, more or less. But I don't think that's what he means. Paul's use of the word tradition throughout the New Testament comes in two different senses. In a broad sense, it's a system of living which is passed down from one generation to the next. Now, sometimes this tradition is a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. So, for instance, in Galatians 1:14, Paul says, "And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." He's talking about the body of teaching that was Judaism. Now, some of that was scriptural. Some of it wasn't. Or Jesus wouldn't have been saying, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," so often. And so some of it was plain Old Testament, good revelation. Some of it was things that were added in. So when Paul here says, hey, I was the expert on the traditions of my fathers, he's talking about a body of teaching which was flawed, not necessarily a good thing. Colossians chapter 2, verse 8 is another reference of Paul's to tradition. Here he says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." And so here we have another kind of tradition, a tradition which is hostile to the gospel, hostile to correct Christian living. So some traditions are not worth knowing and following. And I hope you notice that neither of these uses of the word tradition is anything like, "Is everybody happy?" or "Everyone say something that you're thankful about around the table." It's talking about two very different things. The tradition that Paul is talking about here is a much more complex idea. On the other hand, a body of teaching that ought to be preserved and followed, we see in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15. "So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by spoken word or by our letter." So Paul is talking about a body of teaching that he delivered to them when he founded that church, and that he has continued to develop in them through the letters that he has written to them. And you need to remember also that most of the letters that Paul wrote, although they were addressed to a particular church, ended up being distributed among many of the churches in the region. And so these churches had access to more than one letter. I should say it slightly differently. These churches had access to letters that didn't have their names on them. And would have been looking at that body of teaching. In the same book, chapter 3, verse 6, Paul says, "Now we command you, brothers, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness, not in accord with the tradition that you received from us." So, there's Paul's usages of the word tradition. And there's a negative use. I've got a tradition of wandering about the platform a little bit. There's the negative use of that word, which is a body of teaching which is either diluted or completely wrong. And then there's the positive sense of that tradition in 2 Thessalonians, which is, I've delivered to you a body of teaching, the revelation of God, and you need to follow it. And I believe that as we look at 1 Corinthians 11, it's pretty clear that that second sense, the body of teaching that Paul has delivered, which is God's revelation, is what is under consideration here. You have maintained the tradition traditions that I deliver as I delivered them to you. Just like in 2 Thessalonians, this is a body of teaching that Paul expected his churches to adhere to. It's not something that can be taken or left based on preference, culture, region, or time. Instead, it is something that must be applied to our lives. Now, the church of Corinth, they have strengths and weaknesses. They have things among their people that are good, that are excellent, and then many things, obviously, of course, that are not good. One of the things that the church at Corinth is strong in is doctrine. What I mean to say is that they had a core of people who were really good at knowing what was right. And Paul calls this out in a number of different places, as I'm sure that you'll remember. But if they were strong in doctrine, they were weak in living it out. They did not do good, practical, and wise Christian living. So from the context of Paul's comments so far in the book, and in his broader use of the word tradition throughout his letters in the New Testament, these traditions are the doctrines, the what of the Christian life. In this, the church at Corinth has been pretty successful in knowing the what, but the how, the outworking of these doctrines into the image of Christ, and for the main thing, the glory of God, they have been woefully weak and often very easily distracted. So we can't discard this teaching. We need to take it seriously, and we will when I get to the more expository section here. The next word that we need to define is the word head. Its use in this passage is difficult because Paul uses the same word. The Greek word is kephale, and he uses the same word in a couple of different senses. And that can be confusing if you're not paying attention. The word head from the Greek, kephale, can mean the part of the body which contains the brain, this thing up here. All right? That's the head. And that's clearly one of the senses in which he uses it here. But it also can refer to a few other things, and he uses it in this passage in at least one other sense, which speaks to a matter of organizational authority. Who's in charge? And the challenge here is discerning what Paul means in the various senses and the various places in this passage. Now, I'm not sure if I can say this with complete certainty, but if I were to go back to my commentaries and do an evaluation on the amount of commentary written for certain passages in the book of 1 Corinthians, this one's going to be in the top 3. It's got one of the thickest sections in the books because this passage has produced so much controversy. And the commentators have delved into this word kephale, this word head, and they've demonstrated from biblical use certain senses of the meaning. They've demonstrated from uses in extra-biblical literature of the time around the writing of this book, different senses of the word, and it can take us really far into the weeds. But I don't think we need to go there. And it's also going to help me stay here on the pulpit to not go into the weeds. I don't think we need to go there because I think it's very clear what Paul is saying. And if we go too far into the weeds, I think we get confused. Let's just read a few of these verses. First of all, just to demonstrate. For instance, in verse 3, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Is that speaking anatomically? Of course not. That's speaking figuratively of authority structures, right? That verse is very clearly not speaking of anatomy. Look at verse 6. For if a wife will not cover her head, she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Is that speaking figuratively? I don't know how you apply that figuratively. You could come up with all kinds of weird things if you wanted to. That's speaking very anatomically. It's talking about the head and the hair that's on it. All right? So when Paul uses these terms in this passage, I don't think it takes Greek. to figure out what he's doing. And I don't think the Greek helps, because he uses the same word in both cases. You don't need a degree. It's very clear from the context that in some verses he's talking about structures of authority, and in some verses he's talking about anatomy. And so we don't need to go into the weeds, because your impulse when you read this is probably correct. Oh, there's the word hair in that verse. It must be talking about a real head. Oh, this verse is saying that the head of every man is Christ. Do I see Christ imposed over the head of any man in this room? No. It must be speaking of organizational structures, all right? So this is not a difficult thing for us to get at. It is complicated unnecessarily, I think, by people who want to use this passage to proof text a certain position, a certain point of view. When that happens, when this text is being used to push a certain point of view, there's not a certainty, but a very good chance that person is falling for some sleight of hand, some of Satan's misdirection, and instead they should be looking at the main thing. Okay, last kind of weird spot here is where Paul says because of the angels. It's just really out of the blue. In verse 10, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Why would angels be worried about what's on a woman's head? What in the world is going on here? It's a very cryptic and confusing sort of a reference. Now, there's a couple of things that could be going on here, although I'm not certain. I think there's a very good chance that the church at Corinth knew what Paul was talking about because of his verbal teaching when he was with them there for many, many months. And so they knew what he was talking about, and it wasn't cryptic to them because they had other sources of information which we don't have, some of that tradition, some of that body of teaching that maybe was lost to time. A couple of pieces to clarify what's going on here as well, though, is that Paul never uses the term angels. We see this is because of the angels. He never uses the term angels in New Testament usage to refer to the fallen sort. When he uses the word angelos, or messenger, he's always talking about God's messengers. So this is almost certainly not talking about the evil ones, the bad ones that obey Satan. It's talking about God's messengers. So if it is talking about God's messengers, then what's going on? Well, here's a possibility. He says this is because of angels. Because of might not mean for their sake, because they're watching, but because of their example, because of the way that they have submitted themselves to the authority of God. You see, angels are immensely powerful and gloriously beautiful beings who willingly submit themselves to the headship of God. They are a good example that a person's excellence, beauty, worth is not at all affected by whether or not they have placed themselves in submission to someone else's authority. And I think that's a really important message to deliver in our day. So this could be one of the things that Paul is saying here. Similarly, angels are observers and guardians and function like that often in God's Word. I want to look at a couple of passages. So I've just given you option number one. This is kind of option number two. And I know this is a little bit into the weeds, but the reference here is difficult and cryptic enough. I want to cover that ground. Ephesians 3, 9 through 10 says, let's start in verse 7. Of this gospel I was made minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me by the working of his power. To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery of the hidden for ages in God who created all things, so that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to rulers and authorities in heavenly places. Now, who are these rulers and authorities in heavenly places? Well, I think it's talking about angels. I don't think it could be talking about anyone else. So, Angels are observers. They see what's going on. And so this because of angels could be because they are watching. Now, why would that be a problem? Let's look at two other passages which show us why that might be a problem. Matthew chapter 18, verse 10 says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven." So if it's because of angels, because they are watching, then angels are the defenders of all children. And they are always seeing and reporting and interceding for the sake of the helpless. Also, in a similar way, angels are zealous guardians of God's glory. In verse 23, we see Acts chapter 12, I'll start in verse 20. "Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes and took a seat upon the throne and delivered an oration to them, and the people were shouting, 'The voice of a God and not of man.'" So there was this political problem. The people of Tyre and Sidon, they're coastal and they're island, and they need the produce from inland. And the guy who has control over the tariffs and whether or not even anything gets delivered to them is mad at them. And so they go and they butter him up. He makes a speech. I don't know if the speech was good or not. It might have been. Could have been garbage because it doesn't really matter. Because they said, I think it was planned ahead of time, the voice of a God and not a man. And they were praising him as if he were a God to ease their political problems. Verse 23, "And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory." So maybe what's going on here is because angels are watching, there needs to be a matter of obedience and submission in the way that we conduct ourselves in the family and in church. If I had to choose between the two of them, I would choose the first option. I would choose the option which says that angels in their excellence and glorious beauty are an excellent example of how this can be done in the Christian life. For the record, my introduction was like 3.5 minutes long, and that was point one. I know that felt like an introduction, but that really was point one. So now we're getting on to point two, which is the issues. All right, and here's where we're going to run through the passage and just deal with the various sets of teaching that continue through here. And I'm going to tell you up front that I borrowed heavily from MacArthur's commentary on this section. He had a really good explanation of what was going on here, and I borrowed heavily from him. So in verse 3 we have the principle that is at issue here, where we find, "I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." And this is not speaking anatomically. This is speaking, of course, in a matter of authority and organization and structure. And is it an extraordinary thing that God would impose on families which are submitted to Him a system of organization and structure? Is that an extraordinary thing? And I think the obvious answer to that question is no. After all, the Father Himself is the head of the Son. The Son, who is equal in all things to the Father, submitted Himself to the Father's will. If this could happen in the co-equal Trinity, then we should not be surprised if God has it happen in other equal relationships here on earth. It is not a matter of subordination of value. It is a matter of organization, a matter of reflecting God. If the Son had not submitted Himself to the Father, there could be no redemption. This submission is a glorious thing, an excellent thing, which has produced for us the greatest benefit that we could ever have. Just as the Son submitted to the Father, this verse tells us that every father must also submit to the Son. Every man is responsible to submit to the son. So also in this chain of headship, the wife is to be submitted to her husband. She is not to be submitted to other men. She is to be submitted to her husband. Paul further develops and explains this in Ephesians chapter 5. He describes what this looks like, and we don't have time to go there this morning. But if you look at the way that it's explained, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. If you want to do this the way that God has designed for this to work, then you're going to love your wife, live for your wife, sacrifice everything that you can for your wife, just like Jesus lived for the church, died for the church, sacrificed everything that he could for the church. And wives, if this is what your husband is doing for you in love all the time, I don't think it's going to be too difficult to be submitted to him. I'm not a woman, though, so I won't make that statement too boldly. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as unto the Lord, is what the Ephesians 5 teaching says. Obey him, get behind him, understand his goals and his purpose, and enable them, just like you would if Jesus was there. And husbands, if this is what your wife is doing, won't you be so grateful that it'll be easy, it'll be good, it'll be right to love her as Christ loved the church? When these things are happening in our Christian families, we are showing God's love and doing an excellent and beautiful thing. And it is not about the value of a person. Don't be distracted by that sleight of hand. It is not about the value of a person. If the Son is willing to submit to the Father and to give himself for us, other levels of submission within various structures in the family and in the church ought not to be a burden. They are an opportunity to display the main thing, to show the glory of the Son in the Father. In verses 4 through 6, and I am going to go quickly here. In verses 4 through 6, every man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, she should cut her hair short. But since this is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. In the church, there must be a distinction of some sort which preserves the appearance of the difference of authority between a husband and a wife. This is an example by Christ and lived out by men and women, husbands and wives. In the church at Corinth, this difference was head coverings, most probably because according to the culture in Corinth and according to the Greco-Roman world, it was disgraceful for a man to wear a veil, and it was customary for a woman to wear a veil. This head covering phrase doesn't have to refer to a veil, but it often does, and it often did in that culture. There's actually a lot going on. I'm gonna touch on it quickly and then move on. There was a feminist movement in the time of the early church. And one of the things that a woman would do to identify herself as part of that feminist movement was to cut her hair short. And the really radical ones just shaved themselves bald. All right? That was actually present 2,000 years ago, and this was one of the badges that would be worn to show off that. And then another caste or a class of people would do that, and that was prostitutes. And so these verses that talk about it being a shame, a shameful thing for a woman to cut her hair short or to shave herself bald, were heavily laden with implications in that culture and in that time. And so Paul is saying here, it is inappropriate for a woman to behave like that in the setting of worship. It doesn't make sense. You don't take that, which is part of the culture, and bring it into the church, this is what the church at Corinth has been perennially doing, right? All the time. Hey, look, that's part of the culture. Let's do that here, right? And Paul has been rebuking for them for that over and over and over again. So that is what's going on. He applies the principle, and he says, hey, there's some obvious differences. Now, those differences could be different from culture to culture. Those differences can vary. But the principle needs to be understood that there should be a distinction. Verses 7 through 10, he goes on and says, "For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man." Excuse me. "That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." So man was made by God to manifest God's glory. That's why God made Adam. That's the main thing. In the creation account, it was noticed that it wasn't good for man to be alone, so God made an appropriate helper for him, and Eve was made to assist Adam in doing the main thing. That's what Paul is saying here. So there ought to be a clear distinction in the order of authority for this purpose. This does not mean that a woman is less than a man, even as it does not mean the son being submitted to the father, that the son is less than the father. But this also places the visionary responsibility of how a family and a church will glorify God squarely on the shoulders of the men of the church. If the men are not taking leadership in this, they are failing their church and their families. And it makes life very difficult in the church and in the family if this is not happening. This is an important point that needs to be drawn out here. God made man to be the sharp end of what happens in the way that an organizational body, whether the family or the church, are going to glorify God. Men, are you doing this in your family? Are you doing this in this church? Wives, do you see your purpose as helping your husband to do this main thing, or are you desiring things which actually hamper or prevent him from doing this? And all together, do our families, does our church agree with Paul on the main thing, that we are called to glorify God? Let's move on to verses 11 and 12. "Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as a woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God." This next section has this phrase, "in the Lord," and it concludes with the statement, "all things are in God, all things are from God." Clearly the main thing here is not who has to obey whom, but God's purposes of his own glory. All these things are in the Lord, and they are from God. Now, when a wrestling squad, yes, this is a little rabbit trail. When a wrestling squad practices, people work with people outside of their weight class, even though in competition they're only going to wrestle inside their weight class. So a heavyweight might practice with someone much lighter and consequently much weaker than him during the team practice. And this heavyweight will probably be able to pin a much more skilled wrestler because this much more skilled wrestler is lighter than him. But this does both squad mates good because it enables them to practice and deal with different things. On the other hand, this smaller wrestler that he often beats could dominate in his own weight class. Private practice and public competition are two very different things. Now, why did I just say all of that? Well, it's an analogy, hopefully to clarify what Paul is saying here in verses 11 and 12. In the private setting of being in the Lord, every individual was made by God, is loved by God, is valued by God in vast and equal measure. We are all together in the Lord. We are sons and daughters of the same Father. But in the public setting of the world, organization structure must be present. That structure is father, son, husband, wife. And that must be succeeded in to do the main thing that we are called to do. Verses 13 through the end. "Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife